The so-called Coalition of the Willing says that it's going to provide Ukraine with robust security guarantees if a peace deal is agreed with Russia. The UK and France pledged boots on the ground once the agreement takes effect. But is that enough? And would Russia accept foreign troops in Ukraine? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. On Tuesday, Ukraine got yet another push from its Western allies. A meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in Paris pledged full support for Kyiiv in any future peace settlement to the ongoing war with Russia. The gathering stressed that Ukraine should be able to defend itself, even after the fighting ends. France and the UK said that a multinational force would be deployed if and when a peace deal is achieved. The Paris meeting is seen as a significant move to ensure a long-term security arrangement for Ukraine after the war. But Russia's made it clear that it opposes any NATO members deploying troops inside Ukraine. We'll discuss what this all means for the security of Ukraine in the future with our panel of guests in just a moment. But first, a report from Michael Apple.
Done.
And with that somewhat awkward handshake, it was done. With all smiles from the French president as he, the British Prime Minister and Ukrainian president signed the Paris Declaration. In it, Ukraine's allies agreed to key aspects of post-war security, including boots on the ground from Britain and France, if a ceasefire with Russia is achieved. Commitments from the 35-nation-strong so-called Coalition of the Willing go further than ever before, including an agreement on a US-monitored ceasefire mechanism. But Kyiv wants more, especially from Washington.
These guarantees need to be legally binding. For the Americans, this means it has to be supported by Congress, and we very much hope that will happen.
The US president's negotiators were there on his behalf, acknowledging progress but urging caution.
This does not mean that we will make peace, but peace would not be possible without the progress that was made here today.
But some analysts say the declaration is thin on detail. It's also contingent on Russia agreeing to a ceasefire in the first place. And then there's Starmer's comment, crossing a known Kremlin red line about the proximity to Russia of NATO-aligned troops.
The UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs.
Trump's shifting position on ending Russia's nearly 4-year full-scale invasion of Ukraine has concerned European allies and Ukrainians alike. His chief envoy adamant the agreement has White House support.
The president does not back down from his commitments.
But Trump's other comments about taking over Greenland betrayed the sense of unity on display in Paris.
We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, and Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, Russia's President Vladimir Putin told Russian soldiers and their families at a Christmas mass gathering they have the holy mission of defending their motherland, a sign any peace deal is unlikely imminent. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. From Kyiv, we're joined by Oleksiy Goncharenko, politician and member of the Ukrainian parliament. From Munich, we're joined by Marina Miron, military analyst and researcher in the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. And from Moscow, we're joined by Pavel Felgenhauer, a defence and Russian foreign policy analyst. A warm welcome to you all. Oleksiy, let's start with you. So, as we saw, Europe says it's going to provide concrete security guarantees for Ukraine. Without US involvement, though, are these guarantees meaningless political theatre designed to buy time? From Kyiv's perspective, what does a real security guarantee look like?
Hello, definitely we need United States of America to be also part of these guarantees. But European guarantees are also important when countries like Germany, France, Britain, don't forget that France and Britain are nuclear states. And when they are saying that they will deploy troops on the ground in Ukraine, establish network of military hubs and bases in the country, this is serious. So we shouldn't neglect it. But definitely, United States would add a lot to these guarantees. And we are looking forward to have United States guarantees inside the package.
Marina, as we saw, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that following any peace agreement, Britain and France will establish what he called military hubs across Ukraine. That sounds a lot like military bases to me. I mean, that's a red line for Moscow, isn't it? It's surely a non-starter.
Thank you, Adrian. Well, absolutely. The way I'm seeing it right now is that this is a declaration of intent, meaning is it legally binding and under which conditions? Sir Keir Starmer himself in front of MPs today was talking about a peace deal, meaning that the troops and the military hubs would be constructed after a peace deal. Then he referred to ceasefire. And in any case, any deployment of British troops would require the approval of the House of Commons. And it doesn't look good at the moment. Therefore, there is a lot of unclarity. And of course, we have to think of how do we get to that peace deal? In other words, Russia will have to be asked. Whether we like it or not, Russia will have to have a say in this. And we know exactly that the Russians might use this to say, well, they want to establish a military presence. That's almost equivalent to Ukraine joining NATO. So there is no reason for us to stop the war.
Pavel, what do you make of that? Moscow has outright rejected NATO troop deployments. If European forces were to enter Ukraine in any form, would Russia treat them as legitimate military targets, despite any peace deal?
Well, that's the official position right now of the Russian Federation, that foreign troops on Ukrainian soil are legitimate targets. There will be attacked, which basically means that this all has to be negotiated. Any kind of deal and any kind of post kind of peace deal guaranteeing that this is a permanent and not just fleeting ceasefire, as the one that happened after the Minsk Accords in 2015, would mean they require a lot of negotiation. So that means that Russia would say, okay, you have your proposals, and now we're going to talk about the Russian proposals, and that means negotiations will continue. Russia wants to continue negotiating with the United States, not so much with the Europeans or Ukrainians, but primarily with the United States, to exploit the growing tensions between transatlantic tensions because of Greenland and other issues. And the war will continue while these negotiations continue. The war will continue full steam ahead. Moscow, the Kremlin, believe that Russia is winning, that another more good push, and Ukrainian state, its regime, its military will begin to disintegrate and crumble, and the situation on the ground will change. So that means right now is going to be negotiations plus increased escalating fighting.
Oleksiy, I mean, feel free to come back on what Pavel was saying there, but European leaders talk about commitments, about security guarantees, but there are no numbers, no timelines, no official mandates. What does Ukraine hear? Reassurance? Hesitation?
I want to react and reflect on several things which I heard on the panel now. First is that we're saying, okay, this is a red line for Russia, that Ukraine, there will be military bases of European countries, for example, France or Britain in Ukraine. What do we mean saying red lines? The whole idea of the peace deal will be that Ukraine is a sovereign state. Meaning sovereign, meaning that Ukraine makes its own choices. So if Ukraine wants to have these bases, if Britain wants, or France, then what is the word of Russia here? Why should we ask Russia what they want or they don't want? So this is, for us, it's a red line for Ukraine. Yes, we can agree to stop the war on the current lines, which will mean that part of Ukrainian territories will be still occupied by Russia in the status of temporarily occupied, illegally occupied. But our sovereignty is not under question mark. We are a sovereign state. Sovereign state meaning making its own decisions, what I mentioned. When I heard that, okay, Russia is waiting for one more push and Ukrainian government or Ukrainian state will disintegrate. We heard it 4 years ago. Putin was saying in 3 days they will finish special military operation. United States showed us what is special military operation in Venezuela. We can like it or not, but they did it in 37 minutes. This is special military operation. What is happening in Ukraine already almost 4 years of fighting? Russia failed to achieve their goals. They failed to take Kyiv or any other big cities like Kharkiv or Odessa. Their successes during the last year is just several ruined towns in the east of Ukraine. So they want to continue this bloodshed with no result. And in reality, it's a stalemate. They can do this, but they will never achieve their goals. And that's something which should be shown to Putin.
Okay, Pavel, do you just quickly come back on that before I hand it to Marina?
Well, yes, I mean, that means, just as I was saying, the two sides are so far apart, it's right now practically impossible, I would say, to paper over the differences and find some kind of magic formula that would end the fighting right now. The most practical kind of, I'm afraid, outcome is, yes, there'll be talks and there's going to be fighting, and this fighting may actually escalate.
All right, Marina, US Envoy Steve Witkoff said the security guarantees were as strong as anyone has ever seen and were designed to deter further attacks in the future. Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, said that Donald Trump stands strongly behind the protocols. Is it just me, or does that sound rather vague? You've argued that Europe lacks the critical capabilities that the US has, intelligence, command air-to-air refueling. I mean, can Europe credibly guarantee Ukraine's security without the US?
That is a great question, and that is the point I have been making for quite a while about the fact that European NATO members do not have the necessary capabilities. If we look at the situation with the recruitment into the armed forces, take the UK or even Germany, for instance, and there is still a big question whether Germany would deploy any troops to Ukraine. At the same time, the European NATO members are very much afraid that the US is going to be taking a back seat. And so they have increased their defense spending under pressure and are trying to rebuild their defense industry. So the question here is, can the Europeans send troops to Ukraine and build military hubs, whatever that might mean, and with what money? Who is going to be financing it long term? And so there are a lot of questions related to this. And of course, if the US is not 100% in on this, and I'm not even talking about the political dimension of this, I'm talking more about the practical dimension of this. If the US is not going to support this, and the US has already said, and as you correctly pointed out, has been very vague in its statements regarding its own commitments. Of course, it supports the Europeans deploying troops to Ukraine, but the US itself is busy with other things. And we have heard from Oleksiy about Venezuela, now potentially Greenland, Cuba, Nicaragua. I don't know what else might come. So the US is focused on its own foreign policy within the Western Hemisphere. Ukraine is not at the top of the agenda. And if that is the case, there is a huge question how the European politicians are going to sell it to their constituent populations, and who is going to pay for it and with what money.
I come back to the question I posed right at the beginning, Marina, about political theatre. All this discussion about deploying UK and French troops, is it more about signalling resolve? Does Europe genuinely have the force readiness to sustain such a mission?
I don't think Europe has the force readiness right now to sustain this mission. Besides, if we'll just take as a point of departure the current line of contact, what would the troop density be required in order to monitor it? There is no answer to that. You need to deploy troops, you need to sustain them. That all needs to be paid for. The US has offered digital monitoring system, which is great, but of course, again, how long will the European troops have to stay in Ukraine to rebuild Ukrainian capability? And this is not taking Russia's position into consideration. We're just talking about hypotheticals. Of course, we know, and Pavel will probably confirm this, that the Russians will never agree to any sort of peace agreement or even a ceasefire with the prospect of NATO troops being on Ukrainian territory. So the short answer is no, I don't think the capabilities are there, and I don't think the money is there.
Pavel, coming back to what you were saying about Russia negotiating while still fighting, while the fighting continues, is that how diplomacy works, or is that a deliberate strategy by Moscow, designed maybe to outlast Western political patience? With Marina talking about Western leaders, European leaders having to go back and sell this to their public.
Well, I mean, negotiating and fighting is not anything new. That happened many times during the last century. I mean, in Vietnam and other places, fighting continues and negotiations also continue parallel. And so that's not a novelty. This war of attrition that's now happening in Moscow, there's a understanding. That's what the Russian intelligence services say. They report that to the Kremlin, and it's no secret. They report it to actually publicly, that the Ukrainian state is disintegrating, that it will fall very soon, that the Ukrainian military are disintegrating, that there's mass desertions and so on. I mean, how is that true or not? That's a different question, but that's the official position. And based on that assessment made by the Russian intelligence services, the Kremlin is planning its future policies. That pressing on will bring Russia ultimate victory, and there's no real need to really compromise on principle. Russia is ready to be flexible, as it said to the Americans many times, on the timetable and the roadmap to a final, as it's called in Russia and Moscow, so by some, final solution of the Ukrainian problem, but not on the end result. So that's right now the position. If that turns out to be wrong sometime in the future, maybe there'll be a reassessment made, a serious reassessment in Moscow, but not right now. Right now, it's kind of staying the course and achieving victory, and at the same time exploiting growing transatlantic rifts to break up NATO, which would be the great strategic goal, even bigger than Ukraine.
Oleksiy, I mean, feel free to come back on that. If European troops were to be deployed in whatever capacity, a monitoring or peacekeeping role on the ground in Ukraine, do you think, I mean, would that seriously improve Ukraine's security, or perhaps make things even more dangerous, or risk freezing the conflict on Russia's terms?
First, I would like to react what I heard that, it's a red line. Russia will never agree for some NATO troops in Ukraine. I heard before Russia will never agree for Finland and Sweden to become a member of NATO. This happened. Russia did nothing. Russia definitely understands only one language of force, language of strength. And if there will be a strong move, Russia has nothing to do with this, absolutely. The question is that it should be really strong and it should be really decisive. What I don't like in all this coalition of willing, that unfortunately often it looks like coalition of talking. A lot of talking, a lot of conversations, a lot of meetings, but no practical results for the moment. There is some movement, it's good, but I think it could be much more movement. Is it good for Ukraine to have military bases of our allies in Ukraine? Definitely, yes. Why not? Also, I would like to react to what I heard that, how they will help to Ukraine to defend itself and so on. I want to remind you, after the end of the war, Ukraine will be not an importer of security, but exporter of security. Ukraine today has probably one of three strongest armies in the world, together with the United States and Russian Federation. Why? Because the two countries, Ukraine and Russia, we have a battlefield experience of 21st century. And United States has an absolutely great military budget and also a lot of practice in experience. So that makes Ukraine, once again, one of three strongest armies in the world. That's why Europe needs Ukraine, not because of anything else, but first of all, because of this. And this army will protect not only Ukraine, but in general, the eastern flank of Europe. And that's why Europe is ready to support Ukraine also financially and politically, understanding that Ukraine is key to European security for decades ahead.
Okay. Marina, is Oleksiy right when he talks about the strength of the Ukrainian army? How willing is the coalition of the willing? Italy, Poland both insist that they're not going to contribute troops to this force. Germany has said it might, but not on the ground within Ukraine. I mean, what does that tell us about unity?
Well, the Czech Republic would be another example of a country that doesn't want to commit any troops to Ukraine. And it's interesting because that goes somewhat contrary to what Oleksiy was saying, because Poland would be one of the interested parties, along with the Baltic states, of having Ukraine as a defense against Russia. Of course, what he said about the experience of the Ukrainian armed forces, and that has been ongoing already with the Ukrainian armed forces sharing the lessons learned with their NATO partners. Now, the question is in how far can these lessons be institutionalized within NATO? Because one thing is having firsthand experience in contemporary combat. The other thing is sharing those lessons. So it is a problem of institutional learning. That being said, distancing myself slightly from the Ukrainian battlefield, if we look at the capabilities and if we look at the overall geopolitical picture, we're talking about a hypothetical scenario when the peace comes, but we don't know on what terms and under what conditions. And therefore, there can be millions of things that could happen.
Marina, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but President Trump continues to saber-rattle over Greenland, one NATO member threatening to take by force the territory of another. I mean, how does that play into the prospects of retaining unity within this coalition of the willing?
It is further undermining the unity. You have Europeans on the one side, and then you have the United States under the Trump administration, and the foreign policy and the national security strategy, which we have seen a couple of months ago, is very clear on the U.S. priorities. And therefore, we're seeing that we're returning to somewhat the 19th century concept, the Monroe Doctrine or the Donroe Doctrine. I don't know what the current denominator for it is, but strength through force. That being said, from my understanding, Donald Trump is also interested in cooperating with global players such as China, such as India, such as Russia. So there is a big geopolitical outlook here. And if it favors the U.S. national interest and then sidelining Denmark potentially is not a big deal from what it seems. Of course, we don't know what the Trump administration will do and how much of this rhetoric will be translated into action. That being said, it doesn't look good. Even before Greenland, the United States talking about redeploying its troops from Europe was already a big shock to the European NATO members. And that's why we're having this discussion about the potential Russian aggression against the Baltics, the need to rearm Europe. And I don't see how this is going to happen, because also the threat perception amongst European states, as we have discussed just now, differs. Not all states perceive Russia as a threat. And therefore, justifying this rearmament is also going to be difficult, the same way that we have seen with the financing of Ukraine. We do remember the Brussels resisting Euroclear from using Russia's immobilized assets to finance Ukraine. So we're already seeing rifts there, and these rifts, of course, will be exploited by different actors.
Pavel, if this war ends not with a decisive settlement, but with several open-ended guarantees that Europe, as we've discussed, may find itself struggling to honour, is that security for Ukraine or the start, do you think, of a much more fragile and dangerous situation, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe?
Well, the situation, yes, it's very fluid, it's very unstable, and no one really understands what's going to be the future security architecture in Europe in just several years, not talking about several decades. It's all right now up in air, which is very dangerous because this is a continent that potentially has, well, a lot of money to build up a lot of military might. It has nuclear weapons of its own, not only American ones. The American commitment is unclear. There's conflicts all around. There's the threats of actually escalation of conflicts escalating out of hand into nuclear conflicts. It's a very, very unstable and very dangerous environment right now in Europe. And the European nations are scrambling to do something about it. And this scrambling is also rather unorderly. So, yes, it's kind of going to be a quite time of change, as the Chinese curse goes. Right. Very dangerous time of change.
I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have to end it there. Many thanks, Oleksiy Goncharenko, Marina Miron, and Pavel Felgenhauer.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us on our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Bye for now.